All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Everyone, welcome to Chevalier's Books Online. We are the oldest indie bookstore in Los Angeles, established in 1940. Ken and Stephen, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. You are both subjects of recently published books about your leadership of outstanding institutions in the arts, and you both see your work in the context of the successful functioning of our society and really of democracy itself. So before we turn to the issue that is in the title of tonight's discussion, Arts and Democracy, I do want to ask you both about your leadership and how you actually came into those roles, because neither of you consciously started out and prepared for those roles, and also because of the fact that you both led your institutions for an unusually long period of time. So Ken, you were the president of the University Musical Society at the University of Michigan for 30 years, 1987 to 2017. And you, Stephen, were president of CalArts 1988 to 2017. But even before that, I want to ask each of you to spend maybe 10 minutes or so talking about your institutions, CalArts and the California Institute of the Arts and the University Musical Society at University of Michigan. Because we are here in LA, CalArts is likely to be the better known of the two. So Ken, let's go ahead and start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the University Musical Society and how does it work?
Well, thank you, Teresa, and welcome everybody. The University Musical Society, we call it UMS, I'll refer to that. Unlike BAM, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, we don't have a vowel in the middle, so ums doesn't make sense, so it's UMS. We were founded in 1879. That makes us the oldest of the university-related presenters in the country. And in those years, 1879 to 1880, three institutions were founded, all of which exist today. The Choral Union, a choir made up of the four churches in Ann Arbor, the UMS Choral Union, which sings the great oratorios, they still exist. And then we formed the University Musical Society, a presenting organization that was incorporated in 1880. But before that year was out, we founded the School of Music and ran it for 60 years until 1940, when the University of Michigan, when credit in music became worthwhile or acceptable, they said the university will now take it over. So all three of these institutions continue to exist. We have a really interesting status. It's independent but deeply affiliated. So we're a 501c3. We're the envy of all of our other university presenters, in that there's that measure of independence, which sort of, and Stephen knows because he ran a higher ed institution, that gives that freedom to be entrepreneurial. And we don't have to follow all the rules, but we have to follow some of them. And the idea is don't screw it up. You know, you can be on your own, but don't screw it up. I think the most interesting thing then, 1894, we founded the Ann Arbor May Festival. It was so popular, people came in dressed up on the trains from all over the region, but they packed University Hall, and the fire marshal said, you gotta do something. Well, that was the idea. Then we may need a new hall. And between 1894 and it took till 1913 to have that new hall built. Now, I want to spend a moment talking about Hill Auditorium because it's a famous hall. So what happened? A new regent came on board in 1901 named Arthur Hill. He was a lumberman. And he joined the forces that were interested in building this new building. But as Stephen also knows, sometimes things go a little slow with the board. You need that new building, but there's not the energy for it. So what Mr. Hill did was put $200,000 in his will that a new building would be built. Sure enough, he died in 1909. That will was opened up, and there was money that could build this marvelous structure, but it had three conditions. It had to house the entire student body, okay, which was back then near 5,000 people. It had to have acoustics so good that the president of the university could speak unamplified from the stage, and it had to house the Fries Memorial Organ. And this was an organ that we founded or that we dismantled from the Chicago expedition in 1893 and brought it back to Ann Arbor. So it's really important. A lot of our history is because we had a magnificent hall, opened in 1913, the 20th May Festival with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra performed there. Then, of course, First World War, 1914 to 1918, and we had the pandemic in 1918, which shut everything down. So how do you bring people back when they haven't been able to be there for a while? Well, you have a very enterprising man named Charlie Sink, who said, we bring the greatest artists in the world here to Ann Arbor to rejuvenate things. And he was able to get Caruso to come to Little Ann Arbor. He was supposed to come in 1918, but the pandemic prevented him. He had to come the next year. Having an artist of that stature there just 2 years before he died was a very big deal. And what it meant to my predecessors was, if the great artist is out there, just go get him. Don't make excuses for being in a small town. We got this great hall, great university. Let's just go get them. And so throughout the 20th century, really the great artists in the world, classical artists, came to Ann Arbor. Horowitz performed 15 times on that stage, 15 times. We had the Vienna Philharmonic regularly. We had the Philadelphia Orchestra, over 260 concerts, Chicago 206. Berlin came often, Jesse Norman, Yo-Yo Ma. So the great classical artists were there and provided great energy for the community. Then over the years, we began to diversify our music to have more jazz, world music, vocal chamber music, early music. And then dance and theater became important for us, mostly during my tenure. Then I would guess a story that kind of says a lot about UMS is what happened in 1999. The Berlin Philharmonic came. They were on a 9-city international tour. And the morning after the concert, I got an email from the president of the orchestra, a string bass player named Peter Riegelbauer. And he said, Ken, of all the cities on this tour, yours is the one we like the best, and here's why. You're the smallest town, but you deliver the largest crowd. Remember, we got Hill Auditorium at that time had 4,200 seats, half again the size of Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center. Secondly, you let us play Schoenberg. I mean, other cities are afraid of Schoenberg. You let us play it. Not only that, your audience stood and cheered at the end. Third, we saw students in the house everywhere. We didn't see that many other places. Fourth, that hospitality, what do you call it? Midwest hospitality, with that letter in German on the bed of every single orchestra member. And then you knew how to take care of our conductor. Ken, what would you think if 18 of us from the Berlin Philharmonic came and spent 2 weeks playing chamber music with your students? Now that event didn't happen because when they could come, we had the Royal Shakespeare Company coming. But what it meant was, you're a special place. And the other cities on the tour were Moscow, Bonn, Paris, London, New York, Washington, Chicago, and Boston. And you're the place we want to come back to. So that says a lot about our classical music tradition. But that diversifying was really critical for us to be doing. Then I would just say 2 more things. In 2002, I joined with 3 of my presenting colleagues, and we formed the Major University Presenters Network and gathered a number of institutions around the country that are affiliated with universities. And in California, that would be Stanford, UC Davis, Berkeley, and UCLA, Royce Hall. And that became a major force. That's almost 20 years old now. But one of the things that was critical to the major university presenters was the deepening of our connection to the academic enterprise. Really, prior to that time, there wasn't that much to distinguish a standalone presenter like Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center from a university presenter. But it's sort of like we woke up one day and discovered what a magnificent opportunity we have to connect with the academic units. And when you think about it, everything that comes to our stages, you can connect with something at the university. Then finally, one of the very special things that happened to us is that in 2015, we were awarded the National Medal of Arts by President Obama at the White House. This was an institutional award, but I was honored to be able to accept it. And we became then the first and only university presenter to receive that award, which is the highest award the United States government gives. So that's a little bit of background. We'll touch on some other things later in the program, but that's a 142-year history. Yes, I left in 2017. I was succeeded by the man who had been president of the New York Philharmonic, Matthew Van Biesen, and he's doing a fabulous job. And that's an orchestra that we loved having come to Ann Arbor.
That's fantastic. Ken, thank you so much. Stephen, can you tell us about the origins and the ambitions of CalArts?
Sure. Our history is a little shorter. Founded in 1966 by Walt Disney. Walt had spent the last 10 years of his life on two projects. One was CalArts, the other was Epcot. Epcot was originally going to be a planned city. Monorail was going to be non-polluting transportation. He could never work out the economics of it, so that really didn't turn out as he had intended. CalArts really came from the fact that his experience with his animators and his experience in theme parks was that artists were just too narrowly trained. That if you could draw, you didn't know music, and animation is usually drawing to music. If you did do cinematography, you didn't know choreography and movement in space. So he set out to build an art school that actually applied to the real conditions as he saw them of art making in the second half of the 20th century. Being Walt, he set out to hire the best artists in America. The founding dean of the theater school was Herb Blau, who had just started the theaters at Lincoln Center. The first president was Bill Corrigan, who had just founded the Tisch School, what became the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. The first dean of the music school, Mel Powell, was both classical musician, electronics, although those days that was really not electronics, it was really cutting and splicing tape. In fact, he said you could always tell a composer at Yale because they had bandages on their fingers. In those days, you spliced it using razor blades, and so you cut yourself a lot. Probably the first music school ever to be founded by an electronic music composer. In each case, the deans then went out and hired their opposites. It gives you an idea of how sort of iconoclastic the origins were. There wasn't going to be a single dogma. There was going to be just massive creative input, and we would see what happened. At the beginning, there was basically no curriculum. Students wrote their own curriculum. That worked in some fields. It worked beautifully in the visual arts. Didn't work so well in a field like music, where if you don't acquire a certain amount of skills, it doesn't, at a certain point, it won't matter how creative you are. At the point the school opened, which was 1970, 71, first at, this is one of the ironies of history, first these radical artists gathered at a nunnery that didn't have enough nuns any longer, so they're renting out space. And they regularly outraged, the artists outraged the resident nuns. And then they moved out to the campus in Valencia, where we still are. From the beginning, the kind of wonder that Walt Disney, who was seen as conservative, had assembled a set of the most politically engaged and aesthetically radical artists in America, ended up attracting students from all over the country. Just amazing. In a way, every student was someone who was choosing not to go the ordinary route. If you were a musician, you were choosing, I don't think symphony is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do something that is my own. And that was true throughout. I arrived there in 1988, at which point it was already, basically already had become a legend very quickly. with artists going, first generation of artists ever to go directly from campus to New York and Berlin galleries were visual artists who came out of CalArts. The group of people who took animation, which was basically dead, the Tim Burtons and the Pixar people were all students together. They talked about the fact that they knew that it was up to them, that animation had become just advertising. If there was going to be an industry, they were going to have to make it. And all through the campus, there was just this explosive energy. The challenge had always been making the economics work. At the very beginning, they hired in every position in the music school someone who was contemporary minded and someone who was classical. As a result, at the very beginning, they had more faculty than they had students. That happened pretty broadly across the school. Even at our when we normalized, we were operating at between a 6 and a 7 to 1 faculty student ratio, which is kind of like MIT and Caltech. I mean, it's, or the great conservatories. But still, they could never get the economics to work. So when I remember seeing the ad and thinking, well, I haven't done anything to deserve being a college president. I'm not going to apply to this. They wouldn't look at my application. Well, in fact, what happened is, I didn't quite know this, I learned it in the process. CalArts was at the verge of going out of business. It had had deficit for 5 years in a row. It was drawing down its tiny endowment. And the first search, the finalists were 6 finalists, 5 of whom were businessmen. And sometimes search processes really work. And the combination of deans and trustees said, we're not going to fix this on business grounds alone. You've got to appreciate what the substance is to make this work. So they went out and they reopened the search. And someone nominated me. And they took a huge chance because I had never administered anything except a secretary. And I'm sure she was actually administering me. And it turned out to be a match made in heaven. I would say, I guess we'll talk more about the substance later. The challenge was initially to make the economics work, but keep the unfettered spirit. And that meant what happened outside of class was just as important as what happened inside class. I was just listening to a lecture on Blue Mountain College today, and it was exactly the same pattern as Blue Mountain College, where the dining hall was the most important place. It was where artists met and came up with, that's where the new possibilities happened, not in classes where you were studying with people who were in the same fields you were in, but in the spaces in between. So the challenge was to have enough order and enough economics to make it work, not to lose what was special about the place, which was that free and independent spirit. And then the challenge I added to that, which I'll talk about later, is when I arrived, it was mainly a white middle class institution. And my own politics, and I think politics of a lot of the faculty, just that was not adequate. If you were going to be this doorway that opened up possibilities for people, you had to really open up possibilities for a cross-section of America. And I would say the through line in my years was trying to make good on that process. And we could talk about that later. That's probably enough.
So I definitely want to dive into that aspect of diversity a little later in the evening. And you mentioned this a little bit already, Stephen, but you actually began your career as a scholar of 18th century English lit. So, you know, you talked about how they set out a search for someone new, but how did you end up at a college that was really contemporary in its focus, and how were you possibly prepared by your past to be a successful leader there?
Well, I grew up in a little town in the Midwest, which was like growing in Wisconsin. It was like growing up in the 19th century. Um, I thought I liked contemporary art from the beginning, as to the extent I could be exposed to it, which was mainly on omnibus on television on weekends. Um, but I thought I'll never understand this contemporary stuff. So as I went forward, I thought, well, 18th century, that's long enough ago, so probably I could understand that. And so I got an undergraduate and graduate degree in 18th century English literature. Um, I made this sort of underlying mistake, which is part of what the book is about, which is I thought because I loved to read, and actually liked talking, that I was going to be a scholar. But in fact, turned out I wasn't interested in scholarship. I was interested in reading. And the idea of locking myself away and spending years working on a small issue, not that scholars do only small issues, just didn't work for me. I would say during those years, which included 7.5 years at the University of Michigan,
Go
where
Blue.
thanks to Ken's predecessors, we would see Horowitz walking down the street. I probably went to 5 of his 8 appearances in the hall there. My mother had actually gone to music school there at the point where there was only one grand piano in the music school. And she used to get herself locked into the music building at night so that she could practice on the piano all night long. So there's a kind of, the Music Society was a kind of lifeline during my time there. How did I prepare to become what I became? I discovered I discovered I hated meetings at which nothing happened, which is what happens at the basic academic meeting. You debate stuff, everyone is satisfied that they had a good debate, and you leave where you started. That I actually liked to make things happen. One of the things about some place the size of the University of Michigan is as long as you get enough students, they don't really care what you do. So I actually was able to start a major which was fully interdisciplinary, which shouldn't have been allowed, under the rubric of the English department. I just had to be sure students got enough English courses so that they would qualify. And I was actually able to start a program which was in some ways, although more academic, obviously, like what CalArts was doing all along, which was students making their own individual course of study and proceeding on their own. When I discovered I wasn't going to be a scholar, and again, a lot of what that book, Stephen Lavine, Failure is What It's All About, is my discovering I was not a scholar, having the very good fortune to get a fellowship to go to the Rockefeller Foundation, discovering there that I had an ability to start programs, to listen to people and try to frame initiatives that people could agree on and move forward with. Also, I had wonderful role models. The president of the foundation was then Dick Lyman, who'd been president of Stanford. And I saw wonderful things, meetings in which people would be silent. And Dick, being experienced, knew that silence didn't mean that people agreed. It just meant that they weren't going to create a fuss. And so he would always call on people who were silent to say, and force them to say what they thought, which was great lessons for being in a university environment in the long run. I think one of the challenges of leadership is people think you have more power than you have. And at CalArts, they actually don't mind resisting you in any way they choose. But in general, people sort of defer to where they think the power is. Like you have to consciously fight against that. And I had wonderful examples of people doing that. And then I got to CalArts. I was warned by the treasurer at Rockefeller that I shouldn't go there. That he looked at the financials and said, this place is going out of business. You don't want to, I remember his phrases, they are shipped for voyage, which was his way of saying, this is over. This is 5 years of a growing deficit. there's no way out of this. You don't want to tie yourself to that particular mast. But I believed then, and I actually believe the same thing now, which is something that's great, that really is making a contribution to the culture, will find a way to survive. And I mean, it's not fair to say that because there are terrible things that happen, like a pandemic, of which many organizations are not going to survive. But there's a reasonable chance if you're of high quality that you have a chance. And so I took the chance, and I really learned on the job. I'll just tell one story about learning on the job, and then I'll turn this back to Ken. I remember we were really desperate. I mean, we were just bleeding financially. And one of our only sources of support was Roy Disney and the Disney Studio, who were sort of loyal to the original Walt Disney idea. Roy was the nephew of Walt Disney. And I heard that this wonderful music faculty member, who I won't name, was I got a call from Michael Eisner at the Walt Disney Company saying, we're keeping you alive and you've got a faculty member who's bad-mouthing us. You don't have to praise us, but could you stop him from doing that? Well, I went into, this is my not knowing how to be president. I broke into his class. I said, could I speak to you for a minute? And we went out in the hall. And this is a great musician. Went out in the hall and I said, you really can't do this. We're in such trouble. Please, don't have to praise it, just ignore it. And he quit on the spot. And I went to my assistant, who'd been the assistant of the previous president, John Orders. And I said, what should I do? Should I call and apologize? And he said, no. Again, I won't mention the name, but he said, he quits all the time. He'll call you probably tomorrow or the next day and apologize to you. Well, that was a really interesting lesson in learning how to be president of an institution. So that's in a way, the story is seeing how people who know what they're doing do it and learning from that. And then also learning that nobody really knows what they're doing. They're all making it up as they go along. And if they're making it up as they go along, you can probably make it up as you go along as well. So some mix of those two things.
Got it. And so, Ken, I know likewise you started your career in a different direction, spending a number of years in a different area of higher education and management. So what was the path that led you to the UMS? And did you have similar leadership growing pains as we just heard from Stephen?
There is so much in what Stephen said that resonates with me. So I'm just chuckling. And folks need to know that I had the great privilege of meeting this guy back in the early 80s when he was with the Rockefeller Foundation. And a friend of mine and I were sponsoring a concert on independent scholarship. In other words, trying to give some agency to those folks that don't have a connection to a university, but are doing significant scholarship. And we tried to get foundations interested in this subject. And who said, I'm interested? It was Stephen Lavine from the Rockefeller Foundation. So that's when we first met. And of course, we loved this guy for showing some interest in this subject. And then we've stayed in touch. And in fact, our careers as presidents, overlapped for 29 of those 30 years. Well, I just want to go back a little bit to acknowledge my parents, mom and dad. They're no longer with us, but they understood the intrinsic and instrumental value of music. My dad was the first in his generation to go to college, and he paid part of his way through Rutgers by being the accompanist of the Rutgers Glee Club. And so when they got married and started having kids, it was clear we're going to be taking piano lessons and we're going to be singing in the choir. And that's what happens when you're, in the second grade. And then in the fourth grade, that free instrument comes to you from the public schools. And I picked up the cornet, my brother, the clarinet, my little brother, eventually the cello. But for us, it was Interlochen that was the defining experience. I mean, it became the most important institution in my life other than my family. And we got a guy on the screen named Mike Bressler, a percussionist, kid came from Washington, D.C. We met in 1957, Mike Bressler and I, and we're the best of friends, and we're going to gather for a reunion this summer with other people I met when I was 10 and 12 years old. It's a remarkable place. And so at Interlochen, you're with kids your same age. I mean, you're with kids that share a passion for the arts. They come from all over the world. They're of all kinds of different colors, religious, ethnic groups, and we all wear uniforms. So there's a there's a leveling. So it kind of doesn't matter what kind of money you have or don't. It's your passion and your talent that are going to get you forward. Anyway, I was there 6 summers. In 1961, I met the woman I eventually married, Penny. 60 years ago, we met as kids, and now we're going to be having our 55th wedding anniversary coming up. Thank you. And so I was going to go to the College of Worcester in Ohio and become a religion major and become a college chaplain. Okay. And the year that we were married, you know, when you're 21 in 1966, you have 3 choices: Canada, Vietnam, or graduate school. I don't know if Stephen, you know, had those same things, but I was an active protester against the war, so I didn't want to fight in a war I didn't believe in. I believe that you work within the system, so I wasn't going to burn a draft card and go to Canada. And so that meant graduate school was okay. So I went to grad school in the study of higher education. I wasn't going to be a college chaplain for, you know, I had an opportunity to get to know William Sloane Coffin Jr., who was so good as the Yale chaplain that I said, I don't have the chops to do that, but maybe I can be an administrator. And so I was finishing everything but my dissertation when Kent State happened in 1970, when four students were killed on the campus by their peers in the National Guard. And then a few weeks later at Jackson State. That caused the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, to say, we got to have a commission to study this campus unrest. I leaped out of my seat as Penny and I watched Huntley Brinkley, remember them, on NBC calling for this commission. I said, Penny, that's where I belong this summer. I'll come back at the end of the summer and start working on a dissertation. But what happened? I got so bitten by the Potomac bug that I stayed in Washington. Penny came and joined me. We stayed for 17 years. So I had a career beginning in higher education in the association world, doing conferences and seminars. Okay, I did that for 8 years. Then people liked my conferences because they participated in them. I gave a high value to participation. I wrote a book about it called Little Big Winners, 77 Ideas for a Better Conference. Idea 27, every conference should have a Facebook. Why did I not trademark the name? Every conference should have a Facebook. I mean, this is 1979, folks. Anyway, I became a successful conference design and management guy. And what are conferences? They're not unlike concerts, okay? If you put on a conference, you're going to have a registration fee, or you got an admission fee. You got entertainment, you got speakers, and you got a hall, and you got to make arrangements. And so somebody else on the screen here, my sister-in-law, Kathy Fischer, she was with my brother, my late brother, Jerry, in England, and discovered a group called the King's Singers from England. 6 guys who sing wonderful a cappella, all trained in the boy choir tradition at King's College in Cambridge. These guys are fantastic. Kathy and Jerry discovered them, presented them in Detroit in the early 80s. And I was watching all this happening, and I fell in love with the group too, thanks to them. And I said, if Jerry and Kathy can be successful in a recession-ridden Detroit, putting on a concert of the King's Singers at the dilapidated Orchestra Hall, what might I be able to do in the new Kennedy Center in a recession-proof Washington, D.C.? So I went and rented the Kennedy Center Concert Hall, put on a show, and despite, you know, a 20-inch snowfall 4 days before the concert and a power failure on the day of the concert, I was able to have a successful concert of the King's Singers. Long story short, between 1983 and 1987, putting up my own money, I put on 13 performances at the Kennedy Center, kind of fell in love with performing arts presenting, never worked at the Kennedy Center, but I had a great mentor. I'll talk about him a little bit later. Then the Musical Society was looking for somebody that, you know, had some management skill and maybe some fundraising and marketing skill. And they came in 1986 and talked to me. And at that same time, my wife Penny and our young son Matt, we were all seated around a table, and the two of them said, "It's time for you, Pops, to get a job, a real job," meaning a check at the end of the month. You know, you've had this consulting business that goes up and down. Now you're in the arts, that goes like this. Get a job. So I listened to them, and sure enough, I got a job at a university with a check at the end of the month. So I began at the Musical Society in 1987. So that's my journey. And you know, we both faced enormous challenges, Stephen and me, when we began. And he and I have had a chance to talk about that, but maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that coming up.
Oh, absolutely. So Steve, you know, let's talk about you. You had to face, you know, the Northridge earthquake in January 1994, but that was 6 years after your first arrival at CalArts. So what awaited you when you first got to CalArts in the fall of 1988?
What awaited me was a huge deficit, such that there was not money to spend on anything. And a group of gifted deans who, in this declining situation of no funds to let them do things, were sort of perpetually at war with one another. They just thought if somebody got something, that meant they didn't get it. So the initial challenge was to sort of make peace and make clear that we were in this together, and either we solved it together, or there was no CalArts. And luckily, the faculty at CalArts loved the institution, knew it was not replaceable by an alternative institution. There was nothing like it. And joined me in the effort. So for 5 years we struggled. We did this endowment campaign. You're not supposed to be able to raise funds for deficit, but that's what we had to do. And so we just had to mask the fact that this $50 million was designed to fill a hole, rather than to start new programs. We had to sort of fake a lot of it, a little, somewhat. And the biggest campaign CalArts had ever done before that was $2 million. So this was a big leap to take, and I had no idea how to do it. But we found our way. And this is a nice story. In January of 1994, Janet and I were in Northern California celebrating her birthday. And we went into the local bookstore in Mendocino to get, I think, to buy the Sunday Times, and heard someone trying to get through to Los Angeles, and someone else saying to them, "Well, you could never get through after an earthquake. The phones are always down." We called Janet's mother in Boston, and she told us that it was pretty terrible. She'd seen it on TV, but her mother had a little tendency to sort of overreact. So we never expected what we found. I mean, we had to fly into Santa Barbara. My secretary picked us up and got us back into Los Angeles. We drove out to campus with flames coming out of the streets at intersections where the gas lines had broken, and faced the challenge of having lost the use of all our facilities during registration for the winter semester. In a way, the climax of the personal part of the book, of this failure, is what it's all about. Sort of my life of fear of failure. And suddenly I was confronted with something that was beyond imagining. There's no textbook what to do when you don't have a campus any longer. Of course, a lot of people are facing similar problem right now in higher education, where they've got a campus, but their students aren't allowed on it. At first, for a few hours, I was just paralyzed. I couldn't figure out what you do. And then I realized that what you do is common sense, that we were going to need space. And so I got everybody in the administration to go out. I just said, we made some phone calls to figure out what rental costs should be. And I just said, rent everything. Don't worry about what we're going to use it for. Just rent anything you can find. Because in a couple days, they'll all be gone because everybody's going to be looking for space. And then each day at the end of the day, we'd meet with the whole student body, who the dorms had survived, luckily. And a lot of people, the students live in the community. And we just report on what we acquired that day, hoping against hope that they would not go home, that they would take the chance of a semester in which they had no facilities, or it looked like they would have no facilities. I kept saying to them, if you stay, this will be the most important semester of your life, because you'll recognize that you can make something out of nothing. That for an artist, there's always, well, again, not always, but almost always a way. And this is going to give you valuable practice in finding the way. Well, eventually we put together about 250, we had lost a 500,000 square foot facility. We put together about 250,000 square feet of space over the course of 10 days, kept 83% of the students. The fear was that if we had what turned out to be $40 million cost of rebuilding CalArts and lost a semester of tuition, that we really would not survive, that would be the end. So you do what you have to do, and we went forward. And I think, like a lot of disasters, it turns out to be a kind of blessing in disguise. This was when we were all going through the computer revolution. And I remember the animation program needed, I can't remember the full name, but a reality engine, something reality engine, which costs $500,000 a unit. And there we were making decisions about every $500. And having survived the earthquake, we got a kind of confidence we'd never had before. I think faculty had always thought this was too good to be true. And with that confidence, we got more aggressive, started new programs, new majors. Well, it's a whole list of things, but it really, it felt like my graduation exercise. That when I made it through this, I thought when St. Peter says, "Why should I let you in?" I could say, I was at CalArts during the earthquake and I didn't run away. And it made a huge difference in my confidence going forward, starting things which we never had enough money to really do, and finding ways to do it anyway. I'm sure Ken has some equivalent experiences.
Absolutely. So Ken, what were your first big challenges at the University Musical Society? Did you have a similar graduation experience or challenge?
Well, I mean, I first want to recognize, because I'm always learning things from Stephen, that I hope people have been able to listen to what he did to gain confidence of people. He communicated, these daily updates. Imagine what that means to people who are in the dark when the president can come and say, well, here's what's happening, here's what's going on. And that's what I think the successful presidents of institutions have done during the pandemic,
Absolutely.
when people have wanted to know what's going on. Well, I didn't have an earthquake in Ann Arbor, but some of the parallels I would put right at the top: inexperience. I mean, I'd had one employee for a job a while ago. I'd been in business for myself. And here I was becoming the president of an organization with a significant staff, but a huge history. And lining the walls were these autographed photos of all these famous artists, all looking down on me saying, don't screw it up, pal. I mean, it was really intimidating. And so what did I have to do? I mean, I had to learn. So I needed the staff that was there. But then I started going to conferences and seminars. Remember, I'm a guy that used to run conferences, so I knew their value as a communication device. And so I would go to the conferences and I would say, I'd find people sitting alone. Remember, I'd never been a member of these organizations. And I'd go over and say, well, I'm Ken Fischer. Oh, yeah, you're the guy nobody knows. Oh, well, because they didn't know me. I was an unknown. I'd say, well, who are the 10 best presenters in the United States? Well, we're a generous field. People are happy to share that kind of information. And so, I went to 4 conferences in my first 4 months. And by the end of that time, I talked to about 60 or 70 different people. And there was a list of 16, 17 people who emerged as the best in the field. These became my faculty. These are the folks I reached out in, and they're my best friends, 30 years later. But I recognized I needed to learn from the best. Okay. And so that's how I was beginning to learn the business from the best. And right at that time, there was a task force, a national task force on presenting and touring the performing arts. A little book came out of that called An American Dialogue, and it became kind of a guide for me because it was about presenting, pal, is no more about butts in seats. That's what it used to be. This is now about engaging with the community. It's about the commissioning of new work and supporting artists, okay? It's about what are you doing for education? What are you doing to prepare the next generation? My organization wasn't thinking about any of that stuff, okay? They were trying to hire a guy that would get us out of problem number 2, debt, okay? So I was facing a debt, not quite as dramatic, but something the albatross that you have to face. So here I am, a guy that knows about marketing and fundraising. They'd hired me, and yet the board was really kind of stuck on we better conserve expenses. I said, so I had to get a board that I could help educate, that saw the value of collaboration, because at the time, I mean, when you are the University Musical Society, you're presenting Horowitz 15 times, and the Vienna and the Berlin Philharmonics, why would you work with the Ann Arbor Symphony? Why would you work with Performance Network and the Michigan Theater? Excuse me, and I'll talk about this guy maybe a little bit later. Everybody in, nobody out. I came to Ann Arbor infused with this inclusion policy of my mentor who helped desegregate the lunch counters and the theaters of Washington, D.C. And when you arrive in Ann Arbor and you find yourself in Burton Memorial Tower, literally an ivory tower, stuck there, you gotta do things. So I needed to do some changing of the board. I needed the staff, but I know I needed to see what kind of potential they had working with my predecessor, who was very much in the impresario tradition. Decisions rested with this person. And Stephen and I have discovered we're very much about collaboration. You get very good people, you hire very good people who are smarter than you are in their respective areas, and then you let them go. You have a common mission. And that's the other thing we needed was, what's going to guide us? Well, it was everybody in, nobody out. That became our inclusion policy for the next 30 years, actually. And there's so much behind that we can get into a little bit later. So in experience, I needed to do something with the staff. And indeed, before 1990, I was able to hire 3 people, one who became my programming director, another who became the marketing and communications director, and the other finance director. And all 3 of them were with me the day I retired in 2017. So I had to let a few people go who didn't see the value of the importance of their own input. In other words, they had to start taking responsibility and just didn't have the capacity. I was very lucky to hire, one was 18, The other was 21, and the other guy a little bit older, or the finance director. So staffing, then board, developing a board that would understand the value of collaboration, because they needed to know that. That was the future in our business, collaboration, working together with others. It wasn't go it alone because you're so good. You understand? Then the last thing was get out of the tower and into the communities of Southeast Michigan. That meant communities of shared heritage. That meant the educational communities. That meant the other arts organizations. Become a friend and a collaborator to them. And then the nonprofit organizations in our community, social service organizations, they could become wonderful partners to this presenter. And then finally, local businesses. And there was a book written in 1982 by Waterman and Tom Peters called something about success. I forget what it is. But it had a principle: management by walking around, management by walking around. Get out of the tower and into the communities. And that's what we did. So those were the challenges that I faced. Nothing like what Stephen had, except, we had some financial struggles. But it wasn't until about 5 years later that my board really understood the value of working together with others. That was the key going forward.
Absolutely. And so we're actually almost already at the end of the hour, but there's two things that I want to make sure that we get to. Ken, you already started talking about this. And what I want to talk about is both of your legacies around diversity and inclusion. You were both at your respective institutions for 30 years. So Ken, could you talk a little bit more about everybody in, nobody out, and how important it was for you to make sure that diversity and inclusion was ingrained in the UMS?
This was so important. Getting out of the tower, it was for us building relationships with the communities of shared heritage in our region. When you consider the largest concentration of Arabs outside the Middle East were within 30 miles of Ann Arbor, and we had no relationship with them. Detroit, a predominantly Black city, we didn't really have a genuine relationship with the African-American community of our own town of Ann Arbor. Then there's the diversity of Asian populations, all of which were significantly large: South Asian, Indian, Korean, Japanese, Chinese. And then there are the Americas. To the north, we have Canada, then Mexico, Central America, South America. We had a large Mexican town. When you're in the business of presenting the performing arts and you have not gotten to know, celebrate, present the richness of the cultures of your own community, you're missing huge, huge opportunities. And so key to this was the building of partnerships. And we practiced 4 principles of partnership: communication and cooperation. Those are obvious. You got to communicate and you got to cooperate. The more nuanced are vulnerability and reciprocity. And vulnerability meant you would approach your prospective partner with humility, curiosity, asking a lot of questions, and not behaving like you're from the University of Michigan, that you know it all. We would never say, I'm from the University of Michigan Musical Society, how can I help you? That's the last thing people want to hear when you've ignored them for 110 years. So we needed, and these things take time, okay? And we also were able to find key people in each of these communities: Ismail Ahmed in the Arab community, and Martina Guzman in Mexican town, Shay Wen in our Chinese community, and so on. So I know we're coming towards the end, but this was right at the heart. And my mentor, Patrick Hayes, when he became the head of Washington Performing Arts, chose as his first board chair Todd Duncan, the first Porgy and Bess, and a distinguished professor of music at Howard University. So imagine in 1966, in a quite segregated Washington, D.C., these two men represented the future of the arts. That's the community in which I learned what it meant to celebrate diversity and inclusion. And then I just carried that to Ann Arbor. And that was really at the heart of that transformation. Not only did we diversify our programming and our audiences and our board, but we became that welcoming place for everybody in the community. And so I'll end it there. There's more to say, but Stephen well, I'll let him speak for himself, but I know that he was as deeply committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, acceptance, inclusion, as we were in Ann Arbor.
Absolutely. So Stephen, would you please talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion at CalArts, the issues that you figured out under your leadership, and what happened over a 29-year career there?
Oh, and this is really where we get to the democracy issue. I was raised, as I know Ken was, with a sense of I don't know, kind of elemental sense of justice. You need to treat people fairly. We had good ethical parents. Plus, I had a mother who was trained to be a concert pianist, but didn't have the confidence or the money to launch a career, and lived a life depressed because she hadn't been able to act on her talents. So when I got to CalArts, I really made a kind of deal with the trustees at the beginning, which was I would solve the financial problem. I didn't know how, but I would. But that we had to make CalArts into a fully diverse institution, that we were a doorway to being able to have a life in the arts, and that for America to thrive, we needed voices from every corner of the society who were articulate and through their art and could be heard. And in a culture that, as soon as you get to intellectual matters or sort of words, we're badly divided. Through the arts, you can speak to people in profound ways. And so the very first thing I did when we were still deeply in deficit was it's very similar to Ken in many ways. I went to 3 local neighborhood organizations, one in an African-American neighborhood and 2 in Latino neighborhoods. And I said, what do you need? What can we do to help you? We don't know what you need, but tell us. And if we can do it, we will do it. And I've always sort of believed, and I can see Ken believes the same thing, that you start out with generosity. You start out not what they can do for you. You start out what you can do for them. And so we started youth programs that grew and grew. And I remember at the point where we got the deficit down to $400,000. We were spending $400,000 on these youth programs, for which these were poor neighborhood organizations. We were raising the funds. And a bunch of students came to me and said, what are you doing? I mean, CalArts, you're going to raise our tuition, and instead you're raising money to help other people. And I had this wonderful board chair, Bob Eggleston, who said, I am ashamed of you. It's too late in history to be thinking that way. And he just let them have it in a way I never could have done it. That eventually grew to be us offering pre-college arts education to something like 4,000 young people a year, with about 300 of our students doing it, doing the teaching plus faculty. I thought it was as good for our students as it was for the students who were learning. That our students needed to be exposed, whatever their background. Once you were at a college, you're in a hard to escape the ivory tower. You just are in privileged circumstances. I wanted them, while they were learning to be artists, to confront the real social facts of what America is and what it has to address. And this was a way not to be a tourist in an African-American neighborhood. This was a way to have a job that you are responsible for. One of the things that made me proud is after the earthquake, when you couldn't get to campus because the roads were broken, all our students got to their teaching jobs because they knew in these neighborhood centers, because they knew these kids would be in trouble. They would all have suffered from the earthquake, and that this was the time to deliver. Well, that turned, I'm sorry, this is a, I gotta cut to the chase because I know we're out of time. Doing that just had endless ramifications for us. I never intended it as even recruiting people to be artists. I was recruiting them. The wonderful thing about the arts is you make it out of yourself when you're creating. You can't make physics out of yourself. You got to know physics first. This was a way for these young kids to find out that they had value, they had something worth saying. I thought it would get them to community college. Instead, they were coming to CalArts, so we had to raise more scholarship money so we could afford to do it. And then the faculty had to adjust to the fact that we had kids with very different backgrounds. And it just sort of, then we had to raise more scholarship funds, and it just sort of spiraled until we became, I think at one point, I don't know if this is literally a fact, I'm pretty sure it is though, that we were the most diverse, highly selective institution in the country. And the truth is, people always are afraid, well, it means you're going to take kids who are not really prepared. And I said, no, we're going to take kids who've got something to say. They may not have had 10 years of music lessons before coming to CalArts because parents didn't have money to pay for music lessons, or they went to schools that didn't offer. I mean, actually, I got trumpet too. Ken got cornet. We were offered the chance into music. Kids aren't routinely offered that any longer. And so we had to do admissions in a way that said, what have you got to say for yourself? The interview in many cases was more important than what their chops were in whatever the field was. What are you interested in? What do you want to do with your art? And over time, that had the effect of not totally transforming CalArts, but significantly transforming CalArts. And the upshot is we got more interesting students, students bringing us deep knowledge of again, facts of life, facts we're all in the last year learning a lot about. And these kids were bringing it with them, making their art out of deep substance. And I would say in some ways, I don't want to exaggerate this, but it became a challenge for kids, whatever their background. They would see just how deep these kids were dealing with life and death. And the other students would see, yes, that's what art deals with. It deals with the really big questions. And in the end, I think that's how the university contributes to the viability of democracy, to there being a way to hear what's actually going on in your country and react to it. And I think the same thing happens. It's different dynamic, but when Ken does what he did, building these connections with neighborhoods, you're indirectly opening opportunity in ways that you can't even predict where it's going to turn up. But by opening the door, you make a new America. And I would say one of the great lessons of this last year is that we all have a job ahead of us in making a new, more just, fairer, more democratic America. And I feel like Ken and I have a right to be proud that we contributed to that process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so our last question of the evening, piggybacking on what you just said, Stephen, which is the question of the role of art in a democratic society. I know both of you have done some serious thinking about this question, and it's a big one. But Ken, since we haven't heard from you yet about this big question, would you like to share a few words and thoughts about this before we say goodbye to everyone?
Well, I want to just pick up on what Stephen just said. And I was very lucky. In 1962, I had a chance to go to the White House with the Interlochen Orchestra and perform for President Kennedy. Okay, that was 1962. In 1971, Penny and I were lucky to get the last 2 tickets to the opening night of the Kennedy Center when Bernstein did his mass. And then in 1983, I presented my first concert at the Kennedy Center. So Kennedy is a human being and a president that has meant a lot to me. And there's a quote here. This is what I resonate to with what was just said by Stephen. If art is to nourish the roots of our culture, society must set the artist free to follow his vision wherever it takes him. We must never forget that art is not a form of propaganda, it is a form of truth. And I think where we both agree is we need to let that artist's voice be heard. And what I found when we started out at UMS was that it was a very narrow view of the artist's voice. And especially with the things that have happened over the past year, we in the presenting world need to double down on our commitment to be presenting the word is BIPOC now, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and all the different genders, to have those voices be able to be heard. And it's especially critical at a university campus where the contextual programming that we do, because there's going to be somebody at the university that's going to be able to help us better understand those voices and the issues and the challenges. And I'm very proud of my professional organization. And I mentioned that 30 years ago, there was a guide for me where the field was at that time. It's now 30 years later, and it's time for our field to pick up the challenges of, what percentage of our budget should we be devoting to programming that features BIPOC artists and the variety of different genders. What kind of a commitment over how many years are we going to be dealing with educating ourselves and others about this 400-year problem in our country? Because I do feel we can't talk about art and democracy without talking about race. This is the critical issue, and we look at voter suppression, we look at January 6th, and we look at the past administration. Artists have always been at the forefront of helping us understand who we are, where we are. And I just think in my field, we have a particular opportunity because we select the artists who are going to be coming into our communities. And we need to be much more intentional about the artists that we bring, and to make sure those voices are being heard. I also want to mention that the guy who wrote the foreword to my book is Wynton Marsalis, okay, one of the great jazz folks. And I had a conversation with Wynton yesterday that's going to air later with PBS Books. But, classically trained, but a jazz guy. And he sees jazz as the perfect metaphor for democracy. And I'll just quote what he had to say. 3 things. We improvise, which is our individual rights and freedoms. We swing, which means we're responsible to nurture the common good by working together. And we play the blues, which means that no matter how bad things get, we remain optimistic while still mindful of our problems. And any of us that knows jazz, that is democracy in action. And so I better leave it there. There's so much more to say on that subject, but I hope we've given people a sense of how Stephen and I try to put art and democracy together, and have tried to do that in our work.
Absolutely. So thank you both, Ken Fischer and Stephen Lavine, for sharing your expertise, your inspiring stories, and profound leadership. And of course, thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight. If you like what you heard today, please make sure to click on the link that I've put into the chat box to learn more about Everybody In, Nobody Out, as well as Stephen D. Lavine, Failure is What It's All About. So before we say goodbye for the evening, I know it's very late for some people. Ken and Stephen, do you have anything you'd like to share with us before we end the meeting?
I just want to say thank you. I see there's many good friends who've tuned in tonight, and I thank them for coming. Teresa, I thank you and Chevaliers. Um, we are not the kind of books that, how to say, they're not going to be runaway bestsellers that Chevaliers makes a lot of money from. I hope you make some money from it. But it suggests something about the quality of Chevaliers that you're doing this. And I want to thank Ken. It's been really fun to reconnect. I could actually share interlocking stories with you. We discovered many more connections than we thought we had. And I guess where I'll end is, once you open yourself to the real diversity of America, you discover you have connections with people you never imagined you have connections with, that you have parallel experiences. We could all be living so much richer and more interesting lives, and more decent lives, if we could make good on the promise that that the arts offer us. I'll just stop there.
Well, if I can just have a word too, I want to thank Stephen for inviting me. You know, Stephen's book, and he had read mine and thought that if the two of us could get together, we had, you know, presidencies at the same time. We have interlocking in common. We have the University of Michigan. So Stephen, thank you for inviting me and for writing such a fascinating book. I urge everybody to take it. And what a title. Okay. Failure is what it's all about. Excuse me. I mean, we both know how much we've learned from the failures that we've had. And you know, I think what you've seen in both of us too is a real passion. People don't stay 30 years in the job if they don't love it. And if they don't love the people that they have a chance to work with and the people in their communities. And we certainly have that in common, that we've loved what we've done. We want to stay engaged. And yes, indeed, open yourself up to the arts. Be curious, stay engaged. That's what we're trying to do as retired guys, you know, without getting in the way of our successors. That's really important. So, and to all my friends that are on here today, I got family, I got old friends from 64 years ago. Mike Bressler, thank you. Doc Bressler, the percussionist. Pamela, who plays the Carillon, remember the Burton Memorial Tower, Carillon, Stephen, and Paul Friedman. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Thank you everyone for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your Thursday evening. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.